sermons, almost different sermons, and then they all kind of come together. Or either that or it'll just be a complete convoluted mess, one or the other. But it will not probably be anywhere in between. So to start off with, I want to come back and touch a little bit on what we were talking about last week, which is the whole notion of how can you get in the weeds? The Southern Baptist Convention just passed, broad majority, said if you're a church and you got women in leadership, you can't be with us. And that idea of what the church is, what it defines, I think needs a little bit more attention. But that's one way to get in the weeds. There's another way to get in the weeds. And I heard this story this week, and I really, at first I said, oh, that can't be, but sure it is. A church who will go unnamed, one of their Sunday school classes decided that it would be a nice foray if the whole Sunday school class went down to New Orleans for a Chippendales
show?
Yeah, if you call it that, I guess. Because nothing says sound Christian doctrine like taking dollar bills and putting them into a person's jockstrap, right?
Oh my goodness.
This was part of a Sunday school class. So the church can get into weeds a bunch of different ways. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the early church was like and what the early church did and why that really should apply to today. And to kind of preface that, I want to point out in the last, because we are kind of, if you will, we're gonna build in and focus on the way that the early church operated. And we're going to do that in real time in our little church in the same manner, in the same way. Because I think it's effective and also because I think it's appropriate. So let's start with what was the early church like? So the early church, and let's distinguish this. This is probably going particularly into the time where Rome was beginning to persecute. So it's probably for a good 100 or so years, maybe more. The early church typically met in a home. The early church, what do you think the average group for an early church?
10.
35 would have probably been a mega church. 25 would have been quite normal. Who do you think participated? Was this just one person sitting at the front talking to everyone? Typically not. It was more group participatory, which is why Paul would say, if you prophesy, women, if you prophesy, make sure that you have your head covered. Men, if you prophesy, make sure that your head's not covered. Well, this had to do with the social times, right? But one thing that was clear, what were women doing in the early church? They were prophesying. Now, what does it mean to prophesy? Does it mean to stand up and say, this is going to happen in 2 weeks, this is going to happen yesterday, so forth and so on? It was not. Prophesying has to be with, this is something that I'm hearing directly from God. It aligns with Scripture, and I need to tell people what it is. And then Paul went a little bit further, and he said, now this needs to be done in an orderly fashion. Don't just everybody stand up and start hollering all at the same time. It won't work. Can't do that. But there was clearly, in these early churches, small groups within the homes, there was clearly participation that included women. So we come now to the Southern Baptist Convention and their amendment, whatever you want to call it, to the way that they operate, and it's like women cannot be an authority over men. And you're going, what else? And that's 1 Timothy 2, right? But let's take these things into concert at the same time. 1 Corinthians 11 says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, she should cover her head. There's a lot of stuff in there that clearly has to do with the cultural milieu of the time, but it doesn't have, the main important thing is every woman who prays or prophesies. You can pray silently. You cannot prophesy silently. That can't be done. Paul goes on to say, a man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Yeah, there you see, a man's home is his castle, right? It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. So if Paul is already in 1 Corinthians, he's making a pretty strong point. There are certain ways we need to hold our worship services, but we also need to remember this whole thing starts with God. Because if a woman, like I said, if a woman prophesied or spoke words of truth, it's impossible to remain silent. So this is the verse that has blown up the Southern Baptist Convention. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority. And authority in this word is oftentimes, it's the only time the Greek word is used in the entire New Testament. That right there tells you, slow down. What? There's something going on here that's a little bit different. I do not allow a woman to teach or to oftentimes over a man. She must be quiet. Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was a woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Now that is a mouthful. So all the women who figure if you're going to heaven but you didn't have a child, we got Houston, we have a problem. Because that's, if you just read it, without reading it, just state it. Well, there it is. Women will be saved through childbearing. Well, what does all that mean? Well, first of all, notice what it says. A woman shall learn in quietness. I do not allow a woman to oftentimes over a man. If you go to the section right before that, it's talking about women. And it says women need to dress properly. Because this church was located in a place where they had the temple of Artemis. And the ladies that went to the temple of Artemis dressed to the nines. They were dressed extravagantly. Paul says, you've got to get this all confused. The object of church is not to impress your neighbor with how much your something costs, or to flaunt your wealth. The object of worship is to come to the place, this small gathering of 25 or 30 people where everybody can participate. A woman should learn. And so then it's this thing, so it says women, and then it says a woman should learn in quietness and full permission. I do not allow a woman to assume oftentimes over a man. Now, one of the only definitions, and it's very difficult because there's no other place in Scripture where you can say, well, this is how it's used here, so it's probably, this one's unique. It's a one-off. But one of the words, the way that the word is used in other non-scriptural contexts is to dominate. I do not allow a woman to dominate over a man. Now, First of all, it starts talking about women. This is what all women need to do. You need to dress. And then it's talking about a man and a woman, singular. So it goes from plural to singular. And then it kicks back into plural again. Women will be saved through childbearing. Plural. What's going on? Well, first of all, the whole notion of dominate. I do not allow a woman to dominate, domineer. I think Paul would also say, I don't allow a man to domineer over a woman. That your chromosomes are not what's supposed to be, because, as he just read, we're all part of God. Could it be that Timothy had written Paul about a problem in the church? And we've got this, and this woman is dogging this man. One time, sitting in Piccadilly in Alabama, and there was this elderly couple sitting next to us. I use elderly in quotations now. And the lady was just hammering this dude. I mean, this chicken's tough. I don't know why I got to eat this chicken. And we're sitting next to it, and I'm kind of tuning into it. And he's trying to placate her, but to no avail. It's just getting worse. The comments are getting more direct, and they've been married for long enough that you can tell pretty much we're just done with each other. We'll die eventually, and we'll both be better off for it. You know, I mean, it was like, this is enough. So it starts pouring down rain, and the man, in an act of chivalry, says, "I'll go get the car." So as he's leaving, she makes her last comment under her breath, and it had to do with a certain part of his anatomy being not so smart. That, I think Paul would say, no, that's not really kosher in terms of the way that we're going to behave with each other. But it's interesting that Paul would say, use that one word. That's the only time it's ever used. Now, if you're going to go so far as to say that this proves right here, women can't teach men. But we've already seen that women did teach men, because what did they do in the early church? Prophesy. So their prophecy held just as much weight. So I believe you're heading into the weeds, right? And now we're going to take a stab at this, and then we'll return to our normally scheduled sermon. How in the world will women be saved through childbearing? Well, if you remember, childbearing was a curse in Genesis. You will be cursed in your childbearing, and it will hurt. It will hurt a lot. And so, but it says you will be saved through childbearing. So the curse, the pain, and by the way, if you were having a child in the first century, you didn't have antibiotics, you didn't have an epidural, you didn't have, what did you have?
Midwifery, really?
Yeah. Somebody hollering in Hebrew, push. That was about as far as it went. I don't know the Hebrew for push. If I did, I would. It was a risky proposition to have a child. I don't know what the mortality rate for just being associated with pregnancy. But even if you survived the pregnancy, there was a good chance that the after effects of childbirth were going to linger with the mother maybe for the rest of her life. She might have disfigurement or something that would never be the same as it was. That's a curse. And Genesis already described that curse. But then there's also the notion of what was that the curse, that is the pain, brought forth the cure. Because the Messiah, the Christ, was born to a virgin. Now we know that we know that where the Messiah was supposed to be born because Micah tells us that. Bethlehem. You need to look for the Messiah in Bethlehem. And Isaiah says that it will be born, you'll be, that not only, okay, well, if that's where it's going to be, but it's going to be born to a virgin. Now, some people made a big deal out of this. Well, virgin can also mean very young person, so maybe they're not really a virgin. But the rest of that story is, well, I'll accept that argument, but now will you accept mine? If they're a very young person, then that means they were almost certainly a what? I mean, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the other goose, isn't it? So the curse of childbearing brought about salvation. And it didn't bring it about just for the woman, it brought it about for everyone. So here we see that what Paul, when he says something like that, you're going, what? How can you? What is he talking about? And I think that's what he meant. And he says, if they remain faithful. Well, if they remain faithful is just another way of saying if they really believe in Christ. If they believe in Christ, they're going to be saved by by the very person that caused that particular person and all the rest of the women in the world pain and suffering. So we filled that theological pothole with theological asphalt. And now the next time that you read it and you go, well, that's probably what he was talking about. You're welcome. Because I think it really can be confusing. And it's so confusing that now the Southern Baptist Convention has decided, and they're going to overwhelmingly, they've adopted it the first time, they have to be adopted the second time. They're going to overwhelmingly codify women can't hold any kind of authority within the church. But here's the problem. The church of the first century is indistinguishable for all intents and purposes from the church of today. We look much more like a first century church than all the rest of them out there. But this is a problem where you focus in on one thing and you sort of miss the boat, right? I mean, we're over here slogging in the weeds, talking about what oftentimes really means, and well, yeah, it says authority here, but a woman shall remain silent in church, but yet we've got women prophesying in church, and it's like you're in the middle of the weeds in the mud, and you're slogging through it. Meanwhile, there's an 8-lane interstate right next to you, and you can't find it because that's not what the church is supposed to be about, I will submit. When we're down to the point that we're arguing about the mode of baptism or whether it is whether there's a rapture that occurs before the millennium or after the millennium or whether there's a rapture, you're in the mud. The central message was about the resurrection, and that's what we need to talk about with the early church. We'll get to that in just a second. Stay on point. Why are we walking through the mud when the highway is available? The mud represents overreach. And that's the things that we just discussed. Those are great discussions internally. That's discussions that should take place in this church with people examining the scriptures and saying, well, from my perspective, it says this, as opposed to, well, let's just wait till the talking head gets up there and he says whatever's right because he must be right because he has special authority from God. Really. When we were in the great state of Alabama, the pastor of the church and a deacon came to see us because they were going to recruit us into the church. And we were recruitable. And I remember asking, he's a great guy. Side story, one time we boiled shrimp for him. Big shrimp boil. He was from Arkansas, never done anything like that before. Linda got all worried about, you can't just throw the shrimp peel on the grounds and stuff. What are we going to do with him? And I looked over and it was like, it's like Mardi Gras. I said, well, there's your answer. So he got through. He ate a bunch of shrimp. And he asked, and there was some pot liquor at the bottom. And he said, well, do you drink that? I said, well, now that's certainly an option, but if you do, you will be the only pastor in Alabama speaking in tongues. So he shows up at the house, right? And it was like, I said, well, let me ask you, what do you think is really important about the church? Well, I feel like I've been called to preach. I just feel like that's something that's very important. I said, I grant you that. How many people can remember what you said 2 weeks ago? How many people can even remember what you said last week? How many people remember, Lord knows, a month ago? We've already passed, we've stamped the expiration date well before a month. What's my point? The point is that we need to start focusing on a central highway that we're going to stay on, and we need to constantly remind ourselves of that highway as opposed to going adrift into the field about questions that really tend to get muddy. Those questions are fine, they're dandy, and they will deepen and broaden your understanding of who. But baseline we need to establish, and I think that's something that we can work on. Something that we're going to bring up in just a second. So the point being is this, and I told him, I said, people don't remember so much what you said, but they definitely remember what you did. It's easy to remember that. And so towards that end, what we've done is we've helped a man with eye cancer, with cancer that he had to have surgery on his eye. We've helped several people get themselves out of financial holes. We've helped a lady get her dentures replaced. We just helped a family who had been dispossessed from their house. And just this week, we also got a lady's lights turned on because she and her family didn't have the money to do it. And they did this, we did this, because of the generosity of the people that go here. Now, how does that happen? How does that parallel the early church? Well, the early church, one of the things that they did, besides being this very small group, they had what could only be considered a community response that was just unusual. This is the way that it's been, that a book called The Rise of Christianity analyzes it. It's done by a sociologist. He says, Christian courage in the face of death particularly caught their attention, there being the outsiders. These people, the old saying, the chicken contributed to breakfast, but the hog was committed. These people were committed. They were committed to the point of that's not necessarily how the church is today. It's so much easier to give to this fund or that fund or this fund or that fund. And when you give to that, which is fine, but when you give to that, then it's like, okay, somebody else is now in charge of doing the work. I've done my part. But that's not really the way it goes, because listen to what it says. So it says they were, first of all, they were willing to die for their faith. But they also accepted the risk of disease to care for the sick. Even when they had been abandoned by their families, particularly in Rome, there might be some kind of pestilence break out or some kind of sickness or disease. What would you do? What happened in COVID? You bugged out, you isolated, you went the other way. Except there was this little group of community that was called Christians, and they stayed behind. And instead of leaving, they didn't retreat, they advanced. And that was hard to understand. I mean, people look at that going, they're not acting like we do. They cared for the poor. They cared for the Christian and the pagan alike. I've heard this said before, well, we'll contribute, but do they have a church that they're a member of? Because they need to be going to that church. Or, well, if they're not a member of a church, then we're going to have to send that to the benevolence committee, and they can make a final determination. But the early church didn't do that. Christian, pagan, poor, the amount of help was still there because from the early church's perspective, everybody's made in the image of God. We're not going to just sit here and discriminate about, well, you don't hold the secret Dakota ring, so I'm sorry, you can't be part of the club. One of the things that made the early church so successful was its amazingly radical concept that women deserve to be honored. In the Roman and Greek tradition, women were throwaways practically. It was one thing for a man could divorce his wife. In Rome, you could just simply say, honey, I'm divorced. And that was that. You declared it. The man declared to the woman. But this radical notion of women being honored, and that was seen in the life of Christ, because even like Mary, you're welcome to sit at my feet and learn just like the men do. And Martha was having really hard times trying to comprehend that, but it was quite clear. And that in Jesus' closest ministry, because Paul mentions them, there's people like Junia, who was not only a very important person to the ministry, but Paul refers to her as an apostle of the highest order. Not just of the inner circle, but of that group that actually saw Jesus, interacted with Jesus, and now could carry the message forward as an eyewitness of Jesus. She was an apostle. In Acts, there were two daughters that were prophetesses, which means they were in these assemblies. They could stand up and say, and people recognize that. Listen to what they've got to say, because they've got something that is, there's some wisdom behind it. This is real stuff. Because anybody can stand up and claim to be a prophet. Heck, you can pay enough money now and go to a school that will now certify you that you've got all the apostolic gifts. They're online. You can buy, if you don't have the gift of X, Y, or Z, just pay us and you can get it, and we'll certify. Surely this is ventured out from where the first century church was. They treated women, children, and slaves with greater dignity. Oftentimes in the early church, guess who was sitting next to some of the people that Paul said, don't dress like that. I know you can, but don't dress like that. Guess who was sitting there? A slave. Or a servant. One of the things that, because of the early church that they did, particularly in Rome, was they recovered abandoned newborns. Infanticide was quite common in the Roman culture. Particularly if it was a what? Girl. What would you do? You just leave it on a trash heap. You let it do it. We don't have anything to do with it. Well, the early church, the people went in there and they started gathering these children up, particularly girls. And in doing that, and it was because, and if there were boys too, certainly, but these were focused efforts because they believed that infants bore the image of God. They retrieved them and integrated them into their own families while they found other believers to adopt and care for them. Whoa. And we're sitting around today, talking about in the mud, we're sitting around talking about, well, the Bible never really says anything about abortion. It got to the point, as the movement began to grow, that the church began to establish formal networks to care for the vulnerable. For example, the Council of Nicaea, which was done in 325, decreed that villages establish hostels for the sick and poor. In other words, you need to take care of your people. And this was an uprising of Christianity. Many of those evolved into specialized asylums that not just for the sick and the poor, they took care of abandoned children. Today we call those orphanages. And those originated in the very early church. And that was something that the person that was watching this was going, they're not operating like the world does. It was clear that Christians believed in something more powerful than a myth or philosophy and they prove their faith through their actions. Because if it was a myth or a philosophy, then you'd sit around and talk about it a lot. The Greeks like to do that. They'd like to talk about how many fairies could dance on the head of a pin. Such very important issues as that, and disagree. And the most important thing you needed to learn how to do was to go harumph, harumph, harumph. I disagree, harumph, harumph. And they just sat around talking about nothing and doing nothing. But these people were doing something. So I'm back to the question. Nobody remembers what you talked about a week ago, even when it's as good as my sermons. But they do remember what has been done. Have you reached out to the poor? How did you do that? How can I, if you're reaching out to the poor, how can I contribute? If you're watching online, go to Church at Addis, click down and find Living Waters, and then give. Because we're going to take that money and it's going to go directly back into the community, and we're going to help people. And the more people give, the more we can help. We're not interested in having a war chest of a whole bunch of money that we can now go out and buy a better sound system or whatever, or a laser show, or a confetti cannon. We're not doing that. We're going straight back into the community. By the 5th century, church councils such as the Council of Vaison in 442 declared that abandoned children could find sanctuary inside the church. They recognized the church as the place where mothers in poverty or distress could anonymously leave their newborns in marble receptacles at church doors. The church, now there wouldn't be a need to do this unless what? It was happening. They were abandoning their children, and the church said, we can't do this, is unacceptable. We can't have this happening. We're going to set it up to where you can leave your child and walk away and at least know that someone else is taking care of it. The problems that we talk about today are exactly the problems back then. The difference was, in many cases, is that the church was actually directly involved in trying to do something about it. Because of the radical shift in thinking about women, about the newborn, about the poor, about the impoverished, it began to grow. Interestingly, in Rome, one of the first things that was happening was the people that were beginning to accept it were upper class. Not the lower class, the upper class. And then the upper class, as they were bringing in to get this sense of community, and people would start to understand, and the thing began to grow until emperor like Constantine began implementing reforms, and subsequent emperors ultimately outlawed infanticide across the empire. Now your head ought to be ringing right now, because we have pockets of places in America today, thanks to the different abortion ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade, that said this is turned back to the states. The states will have to, the states can make this decision. And if you watch, you can watch on congressional hearings sometime, there'll be some abortion advocate, and they'll ask the question, do you believe it's proper, do you believe it should be legal that a child could be born and then ultimately aborted at birth? And they won't answer that question. They just equivocate, mealy mouth. They may not answer it, but the church should answer it howling. No. But we need to be all about trying to help those people who are disenfranchised, who've been sold a bill of goods that it's better to just, I can eliminate that clump of cells, and I'll never have any psychological impact on me for the rest of my life. And yet you hear the story after story after story after story of women who never turned that loose. And that's not to say, if there's someone sitting in here today go, well, I have done that. It's not to say that you're not forgiven, that you're not whole, that you're not, but what it is to say is that there's a recognition that life is important to God. All life, pagans, Christians, and all points in between. Well, like I said, today we often give to the underline, fill in the blank, fund. And I tithed. I gave everything that's expected of me. What more do you want? And the question becomes a little bit deeper than that. It's one thing to give to the United, I'm making this up, the United Children's Way. I don't know if that it exists or not. It's another thing to actually change a baby's soiled diaper. Because in the first case, you're contributing. In the second case, you're committed. And being committed is a whole lot messier than contributing. One of the things that we are committing to is we will not follow the easy path. We will, to the extent, and there are certainly different circumstances today than there were in the first century church, I realize that. But to the extent that we can, we will model the first century church's response the same way to the same problems that exist today. As I said, because of your generosity, we've had the opportunity to step in directly and help people in need. Now, we need to do that without regard as to whether they're Christian or pagan or what your beliefs are and all this other kind of stuff. But we also need to be able to articulate the reason behind that. When we see Paul talking to the early church, and that this is just bedrock, foundational, he says, if there is no resurrection, there is no Christianity. You can't build Christianity, at least the kind that Paul wanted to build, without the resurrection. Yet last week, which I'm sure you all remember from the sermon because I told it and you remembered everything I said, something like 35% of the mainline preachers questioned the physical resurrection. And in the quote Baptist community, it's something like, I don't know, 90, I don't even remember what I said. How's that go? It was 90-something%, which means there are still a few people out there in Baptist churches, if that means anything, going, I don't know what I'm preaching. And what that does is it kind of brings about this sort of deal. There's a lady named Ayana Ali. She was a Muslim atheist. Very, very, very popular. She renounced atheism and turned to Christianity for three main reasons. Number one, she saw what woke ideology was doing to America, and she rejected that. Number two, she saw what the intrusion of radical Muslim was doing. And number three, she realized that the Judeo-Christian worldview offered the best hope for a satisfying life, absent some of the problems that were being. One of the things that she doesn't mention terribly is that Christ rising from the dead is the thing that is the absolute motivation. So what? And I'm not just whatever she believes is, but I'm using this for an illustration. There's a lot of places, a lot of opportunities to engage what I would call the social Christianity. Yes, I believe that we need to be helping the poor. Yes, I believe we need to be helping the disenfranchised, so forth and so on. But I'm not going to go so far as to say that somebody needs to accept the notion that Christ actually rose from the dead. That I think has infiltrated a whole lot of churches, and by doing so, they've lost their soul. They've lost their reason for existing. The church exists. The church feeds the poor, takes care of the orphan, watches out for the widow, not because that's the first order of business. The church does it because, well, that man resurrected, and this was some of the things that he valued, and he also gave us those commands. And so we do it because of that, not because of something that we have decided is our what makes this all real, because it's not real unless the resurrection occurred, right? So the question becomes, how do you share the gospel? And I thought about this quite interestingly. You know, churches will have workshops, evangelism workshops, and so forth and so on. But one of the things that's very rarely talked about in church is what? How do you share the gospel? I'm not familiar with it if it is a common practice. And we discussed last week, and surely you remember this because everything that was said was like just burned in your brain. There's three main chairs to this theological stool, or three main legs, that all fit together to make the stool carry the weight. And the first one is prophecy. Jesus himself, and as y'all probably talked about on the other side, he viewed the Old Testament as an indication of me being Jesus. Two things, two very good illustrations. In Luke, he goes and he pulls out the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue and he reads it and he says, the lame shall walk, the blind shall see, and so forth and so on. And then he says what? Today, you're looking at it, this prophecy right there has just been fulfilled. That tells you that Jesus' mindset was what was in those pages pointed to what? Me. Jesus. The second thing that's even more provocative than that, but it's another further illustration, is we're walking along the road to Emmaus. It's just like any other day, except a man's been dead for 3 days and he ain't dead no more, and he's walking along the road to Emmaus with me. Now, I don't know who he is, but this goofball is asking us about the stupidest questions that we've ever been asked. Why are you feeling down? Well, you must be, you can see Jim on Taxi, right? Well, what in the world? You know, it's like, where are you coming from? How can you ask that question? We thought this man was going to be all of that. We thought that he was going to deliver us from Rome, and he's dead. The whole movement is shot. And this went on for a while, and then finally they realized he's the man. And Jesus said what? Didn't you know that beginning with Moses and the prophets, the Messiah had to die? In other words, he connected the entire history, essentially, of the Old Testament to what? Him. And then he says, beginning with it, he began to explain. So, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. Where are we going to start? Well, you only need about 5. And this is very easy. This one is important. It's not critical, but it's important. Isn't it interesting that Micah tells us that he was born in Bethlehem? I do. I think that's pretty cool. Because Bethlehem is like Satsuma. Maybe even Koyel. How many Messiahs were born in Koyel? Bethlehem was a small town. It had a very limited exposure. When you make that pronouncement and you make it hundreds of years before, you might need to pay attention. Micah 5:2. Zechariah says he's going to ride in on a horse, on a donkey, a colt, a foal, unridden. What happened in the triumphal entry? That's just a minor. You say, oh my gosh, maybe there's some other, they maybe just got that right. Maybe. And also in Zechariah 11 it says that the dude is going to get 30 pieces of silver. So there are some very interesting, and just in Zechariah and Micah, you can tell where Messiah was supposed to come from. You can tell some very important parts of the crucifixion, how much he was going to be betrayed for, and how he was going to ride into the triumphal entry. Those are pretty neat, but then it gets heavy. So those are kind of those are the B team. Then you get to the A team, and there's only 2 of them: Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. Psalm 22, if you read it and didn't know anything about the crucifixion, and I said, read Psalm 22 and tell me what happened at the crucifixion, you would be able to describe with alarming accuracy events that took place a few years in the future. If you read Isaiah 53, you would be able to get even more details, but then on top of that, you would get the theology behind why the whole thing happened. He was crushed for our iniquity. He was wounded for our sins. It pleased God to crush him. You would learn about the resurrection, but then he saw the light of day. Just these in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. Those are the heavy hitters. So the first place we need to do is we need to be able, you need to read Isaiah 53. You need to read Psalm 22. Because that's the rest. This is a criticism that I will give, is that we sometimes believe if we don't understand the entire Old Testament, then we get nothing. And I've even heard people say we shouldn't even be reading the Old Testament anymore. That's old stuff. Well, Jesus and Lee Corso both would probably go, not so fast. Because Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, standing alone, provide almost, it's like, okay, coincidence? And then you bring up facts like, oh yeah, Jesus connected himself to that. Look at what he did on the road to Emmaus. Look at what he did in the synagogue. So prophecy, Isaiah, Psalm, Zechariah, Micah. You don't need a whole bunch of them. You can go to Jews for Jesus, and they've got like just a potload of them. But the bottom line is those need to be in your head as a constant reminder that the prophecies were there to validate that the man himself was who he said he was. And Jesus read them that way. The second thing is you got to understand that there's eyewitnesses to the resurrection, and all of these eyewitnesses never backed off of that account. Now, why in the world would they do that? Well, this was all made up years after the deal. No, those are arguments that don't make any sense. They really don't hold the water that people think they do. Oh, all the Gospels are anonymous. Oh, well, show me a copy of an anonymous gospel. There isn't one. These are written down as eyewitness accounts, and one of the things that will tell you that they're legitimate, that they're appropriate, is this is, to me, as a social scientist, this is the most interesting one of all. How did the people who hated the man so much, how did they come to say, we blew it? He's right. He is the Son of God. We need to repent. Not everybody did that, but there was a bunch of people. In where? Where did this movement start? Jerusalem. Where were his enemies located? Jerusalem. That's a phenomenon that you have a really hard time explaining. This is Martin Luther King walking into a Klan meeting and walking out with everybody deciding we got it all wrong. This is Billy Graham walking into the Church of Satan and saying, you guys need to listen to what I'm telling you. And they get it. And they all renounce what they thought was right. The reason why, and these people would say, well, the reason we were wrong is because of what? The resurrection. Peter said, in Acts 2, you guys, you did it. You, with the help of evil men, put this man to rest. Put this man to death. But then 3 days later, he arose from the dead, and now we declare him both Lord and Savior. This was to a bunch of Jews who said that man was cursed. That man, we hate that man. Give us the crook before, let the crook go. Just kill him. And then on top of that, I guess you probably have to add in there Paul and James, the half-brother. I thought he was nuts. I swear to you. He could be on Dr. Phil. You know, James, what were your true feelings? Well, Doc, I thought he was crazy. I mean, we went to this house, There were so many people inside this house, you couldn't walk, it was crazy. We couldn't get to him. We hollered, tell him his family's out here. And that knucklehead sent back, who's the family? My family's in here. And we decided right there and right then, he's out of his mind. Mark 3. But now that same guy who happened to be a half-brother, which means he followed him around a lot, right? Now he gets thrown off of the temple, because he won't shut up, according to Josephus. That's not recorded in the Bible. That's extra biblical. Probably because that happened after all of those books were written. The same thing with Paul. He hated people. He was able to sit there and watch and grin while people got stoned. That's not normal. That's psychopathic. I mean, that's Jeffrey Dahmer kind of stuff. But they did it. They changed. His closest enemies changed. There were eyewitnesses that never said any different. And there were prophecies that said this was going to happen. Didn't you know the Messiah had to die? Come on, guys. That is our mantra. That is our calling card. We're not going to worry about whether you're male or female. If God has something that is placed on your heart and you've studied these scriptures carefully, then we'd like to hear about it. Because that's the way the first century church did. It's a very simple message. If somebody had to summarize all this, what is the gospel? Oh, that's easy. Christ lived, Christ died for the redemption of sin, Christ was raised again on the third day. That is the gospel. Paul said that is the gospel. That was passed on to me, and I'm passing it on to you of first most importance. In other words, if you don't get anything else, get this. Yet I would challenge if you walked into a bunch of churches today and said, what is the gospel? I would not be so shocked if the variance in responses went from alpha to omega. It'll be, well, the gospel is good news. I didn't say what it is. I said, what are the steps to the gospel? That's it. Christ lived, Christ died for the redemption of sins, Christ was raised on the third day. Now, because of that, we reach out to the needy. We reach out to the wounded. We reach out to the rejected. And we do it without regard to race, color, creed, sex, gender, or belief. Because the more opportunity that we have to do that, then the more opportunity we have to show that our community, our little church, offers something like we talked about last week, where that person, you're walking up to this hut in Honduras. We don't have fancy place. We don't have all that stuff, and we don't need all that stuff. I don't want all that stuff. But just like that little, what I would like is like that little hut in Honduras when the missionary team was walking up there to this church, this house church that was run by a woman, and it was in a hut, and it was on a muddy road, and it was with with muddy ruts, but they had to stop because on the way in, the presence of God had just basically smacked them in the face. Now, if we are to be about the work and we can exhibit we can exhibit Christ in us, the hope of glory, then that makes us much more like the early church, as opposed to all of the structures and layers of bureaucracy and blah, blah, blah that the modern church has become. And we don't need a resolution at some conference to make that official. That's just simply our commitment today. So, we will continue to focus, hone in on, get familiar with the idea of the prophecies. We'll continue to get familiar with the life of these eyewitnesses, how they began to understand these things as to what actually happened. And then you really need to examine that idea of how can somebody hate somebody and then turn around and follow somebody. Why would they do that? What was it that changed their mind? And think about your own life where there's that one person that if they were on fire, you wouldn't have gone and got the water hose. But yet somehow then you're thinking about them has completely changed. What would it take to do that? How extraordinary would that be? And it multiplied times 1,000, because that's where the Jewish culture was that crucified Christ. So I'm kind of excited in the sense that we can now really define our mission, how we're going to do it. I would encourage everyone to give generously. I don't talk about tithes. The New Testament doesn't talk about tithes. The New Testament talks about just be a cheerful giver. Why am I going to be a cheerful giver? Because we're going to take that stuff and bless somebody. That's why. And I can take years and years and years and years, and we can put that together, and we can do more than just yours. So that's where the church begins to build capital. It begins to build momentum. But the mission is one that the mission is every day we walk out of here, who's somebody in need and how can we help them? And that was what the first century church was doing. And they were doing it because they had been changed. I can't think of anything else to say. That's all. Father, we thank you for the opportunity. First of all, we thank you for the challenge, clear challenge. Feed the poor. Take care of the hungry. House the dispossessed. Be my hands and feet. Don't worry about whether they believe or don't believe. But always be prepared to give an account for the hope that we have. And the hope that we have comes from three primary sources: the historical basis of the prophecies, the reality of the eyewitnesses, and then the changed lives of the people who hated him the most. You've got to explain all three of those, and to explain them with anything other than the resurrection comes up short. If somebody's sitting at their house today and asking themselves, could that possibly be true? Think of a better explanation and email it to me. I'll get back to you. But the fact of the matter is, there is no better explanation. The simple fact of the matter is, the best reason that people did what they did and said what they said is because the resurrection occurred. And if the resurrection occurred, that power is available to us. So now let's change Paul's words a little bit. Since there is a resurrection, we amongst all people are not to be pitied. And that brings us hope, joy, and comfort. May we extend that to others that desperately need all three. It's in your Son's name we prayed, and everyone said,